Vandals had scrawled "boat trash" across my late uncle's immaculate cabin cruiser as I slept on board. I'm referring to luminous orange letters, 8 inches high, running down 40 feet of unblemished white fiberglass, like crimson on a bridal gown. The aerosol can was still emitting a faint hiss when I discovered it at 6:00 a.m. The perpetrator clearly intended for me to hear it, to smell the acrid fumes stinging my nostrils, and to witness my inheritance being defiled in the present moment. This vessel had endured 3 decades of Colorado mountain storms without a single mark. Now, it resembles a monument to disgrace, visible from every residence on the lake. The tacky paint transfers to my hands like an orange stain of guilt that refuses to wash away. The violation notice was affixed to my windshield with duct tape. HOA President Delilah Thornfield insisted I move my boat for generating unsightly ripples. I had 72 hours or I'd face $500 in daily fines. What would be your course of action if your family's legacy were desecrated? Where are you all tuning in from? Share your most dreadful HOA story below. Allow me to rewind and explain the origins of this ordeal. I am Marcus Blackwood, a 52-year-old retired Navy logistics officer whose 2-decade career was spent ensuring aircraft carriers remained supplied across 3 different oceans. Following a difficult divorce, I was languishing in a confined San Diego apartment, observing my 15-year-old daughter, Sage, vanish into her smartphone during our strained weekend encounters. That's when Uncle Ezra passed away at 89, bequeathing me his lakefront cottage nestled in the Colorado Rockies. He was the sole relative who ever truly cared about me. I had only been there perhaps twice in my childhood, but Ezra was our family's revered figure. He constructed everything himself, right down to a hand-hewn dock that had withstood 40 Colorado winters without a single repair. The man had lived without debt for 3 decades in a system designed to keep you indebted forever. Alpine Lake is situated like a divine, private swimming pool cradled between pine-clad peaks. Its 300 acres of water so transparent you can spot trout gliding 30 feet below the surface. Ezra's cottage is a testament to 1940s craftsmanship, featuring substantial log walls, a river stone fireplace, and a wraparound porch that carries the scent of pine sap and distant memories. It was entirely paid off, which felt like inheriting a winning lottery ticket after years of rental servitude. The community appeared to be a picture postcard paradise, with 47 homes dotted along the pristine shoreline, lawns manicured to magazine cover perfection, and luxury vehicles worth more than the average person's home. The Lakeside Estates HOA charged a monthly fee of $350 to uphold property values and community standards, for whatever that entailed. It was then that I encountered the dictator in khakis, Delilah Thornfield, 58, a former corporate HR enforcer who had become the HOA's president for life. She presides from an $800,000 glass fortress positioned directly opposite my modest log cabin, an architectural statement that was the equivalent of a middle finger aimed at Ezra's unpretentious lifestyle. Her white BMW X7 is parked in a circular driveway like a monarch's throne, perpetually free of even a speck of mountain dust. Delilah's wardrobe consists exclusively of crisply pressed country club attire. She wields clipboards as if they were weapons and has handed out 127 violation notices in just 2 years. Neighbors speak in hushed tones about her measuring lawns with rulers, timing dog walks with a stopwatch, and documenting infractions with forensic-level precision. 2 families had already sold their homes and escaped her reign of suburban oppression. The initial confrontation occurred in my second week, at 7 a.m. on my dock. I was sipping coffee, enjoying the sunrise as it painted the mountains in gold, when the clicking of her designer heels on the wooden planks began, sounding like a countdown. Her department store fragrance assaulted my senses like a form of chemical warfare, a flowery assault on the crisp mountain air. "Your boat creates unsightly ripples that disturb our peaceful lake aesthetic," she declared, her clipboard held high as if she were delivering divorce papers. I looked over at my 1985 Belliner 3270, Uncle Ezra's pride and joy, which was impeccably maintained but clearly showed its honest age beside the neighbor's floating mansions. "Ma'am, it's fully registered and insured. I am well within my rights." Her smile was so sharp it could have fractured the dock's planks. "We shall see about that, won't we?" What ensued was a campaign of psychological warfare camouflaged as community concern. On day 10, a certified violation notice arrived. On day 15, a lawyer's threat regarding community standards. On day 20, An anonymous complaint was filed with the county, alleging I was running an unlicensed commercial vessel. A ludicrous claim, as I only used it for weekend fishing and evening cruises when Sage was visiting. Day 25 marked Delilah's masterstroke. A petition endorsed by 12 neighbors, asserting that my boat was somehow ruining their quality of life. According to these individuals, the gentle hum of my diesel engine, which was quieter than their leaf blowers, shattered the morning tranquility like a chainsaw symphony. As the mountain mist rose from the lake each morning like ethereal fingers, I began to puzzle over how Uncle Ezra had managed to live here so peacefully. His old toolbox, resting on the porch, was filled with decades of practical knowledge, yet nothing had prepared me for a foe armed with HOA covenants and boundless malice. That was when they ruined his boat. That was when they crossed the line and made it personal. After finding my defaced boat, I did what any former Navy officer would. I approached the situation as a military operation and began compiling intelligence on the adversary. The first mission was to infiltrate the county courthouse. I spent 6 hours sifting through HOA covenants in a basement that smelled of aged paper and bureaucratic resignation. The majority of the documents were typical suburban control freakery, the tyranny of grass height regulations, the fascism of approved paint colors. The standard playbook for a small-town despot, however, something in Section 12 caught my attention. Original property owners retained certain grandfathered rights. In my Navy years, I had learned that overlooked paperwork frequently held the keys to success. This discovery felt like finding an enemy submarine's coordinates concealed within routine supply manifests. Next, I established a security perimeter around my dock, installing for weatherproof night vision cameras, the kind that could detect a raccoon raiding trash cans at midnight. All video was uploaded to cloud storage, a place Delilah couldn't access even with a crowbar and a court order. Deputy Rodriguez, a seasoned veteran who appeared to have endured actual wars, handled my vandalism report with military-like precision. He documented every orange letter with photographs and collected paint samples as if they were CSI evidence. "Son," he remarked while jotting down notes, "we've had 3 HOA harassment complaints just this month. These suburban tyrants are getting out of control." My counteroffensive was both swift and precise. I sent a certified demand letter asking for $3,500 for the boat repairs, an immediate cessation of all harassment, and a formal written apology. I delivered copies by hand to ensure Princess Delilah couldn't feign ignorance due to postal issues. Her reaction was the equivalent of nuclear war disguised as community interest. Within 48 hours, she had called an emergency board meeting with the subtlety of a smoke detector. The agenda stated, addressing problem resident and implementing necessary protective measures. Bureaucratic jargon for "let's ruin this man's life before he can retaliate." Delilah's master plan exposed the thinking of a genuine sociopath. A new covenant amendment that would ban any watercraft over 25 feet or older than 10 years. If it passed, my boat would be deemed contraband overnight, subject to daily fines that could bankrupt a small nation. But she didn't stop there. She initiated a propaganda effort worthy of a political campaign, distributing flyers that claimed my boat was an environmental threat. In Delilah's distorted reality, my well-maintained diesel engine was personally responsible for killing every fish in the lake. The most comical moment occurred when she enlisted volunteer photographers to document my excessive wake violations. Imagine this. 3 grown adults stationed around the lake with cameras, like paparazzi stalking celebrities, waiting for me to commit the grave offense of driving my boat. When I finally took my evening cruise, moving at the speed of a grandmother in a wheelchair, they snapped pictures as if I were performing aquatic stunts. Then came the pivotal discovery that would turn the tide of this entire conflict. While sorting through Uncle Ezra's basement, a space that smelled of motor oil and accumulated wisdom, I stumbled upon a cardboard box labeled property papers in his meticulous script. Inside were manila folders filled with decades of documents, like an archaeological record of legal history. Tax forms, surveys, and correspondence from an era when men actually wore hats. A yellow deed from 1923 made me freeze. Its language included phrases about riparian ownership extending to high watermark and the grantor retaining perpetual rights to lake water usage. I didn't grasp all the legal jargon, but a gut feeling, the same instinct that had navigated me through Navy logistics crises, insisted this document was critically important. My clandestine intelligence gathering uncovered the community's underground resistance. 3 neighbors approached me like covert operatives sharing state secrets. Beth Morrison, a retired teacher, whispered during an encounter at the mailboxes, She ruined the Hendersons 2 years ago. $15,000 in fines for growing tomatoes she said violated aesthetic standards. With 3 kids, they couldn't afford the legal fight. Jim Santos, a Vietnam veteran, had his own war story. A $2,000 fine for painting my mailbox the wrong shade of green. She brought a color wheel to prove it. That woman makes drill sergeants seem easygoing. The pattern became as clear as ice forming on the lake's surface. Delilah systematically went after anyone who disrupted her fantasy of a suburban paradise, then weaponized HOA bureaucracy to push them into financial submission or force them out of the community. She was a serial neighborhood aggressor, and I was her latest target. However, unlike her prior victims, I possessed military training in managing hostile situations. 20 years of handling supply chain warfare had taught me patience, thorough preparation, and the tactical benefit of allowing one's enemies to reveal their vulnerabilities before you strike the decisive blow. My morning coffee rituals on the dock transformed into strategic planning sessions. The scent of pine needles mingled with diesel fumes as I drafted battle plans like a general preparing for a siege. The evening rumble of my boat's engine became a tool of psychological warfare, a daily reminder that some battles are worth fighting, and some bullies must learn that targeting the wrong person can demolish everything they have built. The woman believed she was hunting defenseless prey. She had no idea she had just hooked a predator. Delilah's next action demonstrated she had transitioned from a neighborhood tyrant to an actual felon. I found her handiwork after a tranquil grocery trip into town, my weekly respite from the suburban theater of conflict at the lake. Upon returning with enough provisions to withstand a siege, I discovered my boat adrift like a phantom vessel 50 yards from the shore, its hull scraping against rocks with every passing wave. Uncle Ezra's immaculate hull now bore fresh gouges along the waterline, battle wounds that made my gut tighten. The dock lines hadn't simply come loose or frayed with age. Someone had severed them with surgical precision, leaving behind clean cuts that indicated premeditated sabotage. My security cameras immortalized the crime in grainy, night vision poetry. A figure dressed in dark clothing moved with practiced efficiency at 2 a.m., then disappeared like a suburban ninja. But criminals invariably leave clues. There, idling at the edge of the frame like a smoking gun, was Delilah's unmistakable white BMW X7. The woman had personally carried out this midnight raid, too narcissistic to entrust her dirty work to anyone else. My reaction was immediate and unforgiving. I converted my dock into a fortress that would intimidate Navy SEALs, complete with motion-activated floodlights powerful enough to illuminate a small aircraft, battery backups capable of surviving an electromagnetic pulse, and redundant cloud storage systems spread across 3 time zones. Every piece of equipment was secured with marine-grade locks that would pose a challenge to master thieves. More importantly, I became a documentarian of suburban conflict, Colorado's one-party consent laws. A piece of knowledge acquired during my unpleasant divorce meant that every conversation, violation notice, and incident of harassment could be recorded as courtroom-ready evidence. My phone transformed into a weapon of legal mass destruction. A Zoom meeting with a maritime lawyer introduced me to legal principles that made my tactical mind rejoice. A concept known as navigational servitude grants rights to waterway usage that supersede the regulations of local busybodies. HOAs can nitpick about dock colors and boat covers, but controlling the actual use of the water requires legitimate governmental authority, something Princess Delilah's suburban fiefdom certainly did not possess. Simultaneously, my archaeological dig at the courthouse was yielding buried treasure that would fundamentally alter this entire conflict. Alpine Lake was not some pristine natural marvel. It was man-made, created in 1918 when my great-great-grandfather, Silas Blackwood, dammed a mountain stream for his logging empire. The man had forged civilization out of the wilderness with nothing but resolve and a strategic ruthlessness that seemed to run in the family. The definitive proof came from a 1923 deed that set my pulse racing. Grantor retains perpetual rights to lake water usage and access. Their property records confirmed an unbroken line of ownership, from Silas to his son, then to Uncle Ezra, and finally landing in my possession like inherited artillery. These were water rights that had never been sold, transferred, or relinquished to any developer or suburban despot. The beautiful irony became crystal clear. In 1985, developers constructed lakeside estates under the assumption they had obtained lake access rights they had never actually bought. For 38 years, the HOA had been functioning under a delusion of authority they did not legally hold. Every lake maintenance fee they had ever collected was potentially theft from my family's estate. But Delilah was escalating her campaign faster than a rocket taking off. She put forward a $5,000 emergency assessment, framed as an environmental protection measure but actually intended to fund a prolonged legal battle against me. Her propaganda depicted my boat as an ecological catastrophe on par with the Exxon Valdez. In her warped version of reality, my gentle diesel engine was single-handedly annihilating fish families and destroying aquatic habitats simply by existing. The absurdity reached its zenith when she hired a marine expert who happened to be her brother-in-law's kayak rental partner. This nautical prodigy produced a handwritten report on coffee-stained napkins, concluding that my 25-foot boat somehow caused more environmental harm than the neighbor's 35-foot speedboats. His scientific approach involved standing on the shore and squinting very hard at the wave patterns. Delilah's Facebook propaganda machine launched a Save Our Lake campaign, complete with sunset pictures and captions about safeguarding natural heritage from industrial-scale commercial exploitation. She shared images of my boat with descriptions that made it sound like a floating oil rig disrupting peaceful family swims. Her discrimination grew less subtle by the day. References to outside agitators and undesirable elements began to appear in her social media posts, along with insinuations that my lifestyle choices were a threat to property values. Corporate HR departments would have dismissed her for less obvious bigotry. My covert intelligence network grew as more neighbors shared their stories of resistance. The pattern was unmistakable. A systematic campaign to eliminate anyone who challenged Delilah's vision of a suburban utopia. Families were destroyed through financial warfare, driven to surrender or exile by a woman intoxicated with petty power. But I wasn't a helpless family with vulnerable children and crushing mortgage payments. I was a combat veteran with pension security, research capabilities, and a growing mountain of evidence suggesting this entire HOA was exceeding its legal authority by approximately 100%. Evening strolls around what could very well be my private lake were filled with the perfume of pine needles and the sound of children's laughter. The sounds of community joy being weaponized by a sociopath who had declared war on a military-trained opponent. She believed she was destroying a defenseless victim. She had actually provoked a predator armed with legal nuclear weapons. Delilah's desperation soared to new heights when she opted to weaponize the legal system itself. A certified letter arrived on a Tuesday morning. A declaration of war delivered by a postal worker who seemed apologetic for carrying such blatant hostility. HOA Attorney Services, a law firm specializing in suburban oppression, demanded the immediate removal of my boat under threat of a $10,000 fine and a lawsuit for covenant violations and community disruption. The letter's language was steeped in legal intimidation, crafted to frighten ordinary homeowners into submission. They asserted that by inheriting the property, I had signed binding HOA agreements, making me subject to all current and future covenant amendments. I was given 10 days to comply or face litigation that would pursue all available remedies, including monetary damages and injunctive relief. Translation: surrender, or we will bankrupt you with legal fees. My response was an act of surgical precision delivered on expensive letterhead. I retained Sarah Chan, a local property attorney whose reputation for dismantling HOA overreach was known to give suburban dictators nightmares. Sarah's initial review of my water rights documents caused her to laugh out loud during our first meeting. "Marcus," she stated, examining Uncle Ezra's collection of deeds, "this isn't just a strong legal position. This is thermonuclear warfare disguised as property law." Sarah promptly filed a preliminary injunction to prevent the HOA from limiting my lake access while we readied our nuclear option. Her counter-demand letter was elegantly simple. Prove your authority over the lake's usage or retract all threats immediately. Meanwhile, my research had yielded the legal equivalent of buried treasure. The developer who created Lakeside Estates in 1985 had made a critical mistake in property acquisition. His warranty deed specifically excluded all water rights and riparian privileges from the sale to individual homeowners. The HOA covenants had a loophole so vast you could sail an aircraft carrier through it. No legal authority over the lake itself. County records designated Alpine Lake as a private body of water with riparian access rights, which meant whoever held those rights was in control of everything. The HOA had been collecting lake maintenance fees for 38 years without any legal basis, akin to charging tolls on someone else's private driveway. But the true bombshell dropped when I hired a licensed surveyor to map the exact property boundaries. The professional survey showed that my inherited property extended 30 feet further into the lake than anyone had realized. The precious docks of several HOA members were, in fact, trespassing on my riparian zone. Most gratifyingly, Delilah's decorative gazebo, her personal lakeside meditation pavilion where she concocted her schemes of neighborhood destruction, was situated entirely on my legal property. The woman had been waging her war against me from land that I technically owned. Delilah's reaction to my legal counterattack was predictably nuclear. An emergency board meeting resulted in the approval of a $25,000 legal budget, money that would need to be raised through homeowner assessments since the HOA's reserves were insufficient for a prolonged conflict. She reached out to a local newspaper reporter, dropping hints about environmental concerns and community safety issues in an attempt to create public pressure through media manipulation. Her most desperate gambit involved the State Parks Department. Delilah lodged complaints asserting I needed commercial permits for my boat, despite clear evidence of its private, recreational use. When that tactic failed, she organized a community safety meeting, insinuating that my vessel was a navigational threat to children and elderly swimmers. The underground resistance movement gained momentum as neighbors observed Delilah's increasingly erratic behavior. Beth Morrison provided documentation of past harassment campaigns. Families compelled to dismantle playground equipment deemed aesthetically inappropriate, and elderly residents fined for using medical equipment that violated visual standards. Young couples had been bankrupted over mailbox height infractions measured with carpenter's levels. Jim Santos disclosed the most damning intelligence: HOA financial records that revealed a pattern of costly legal battles, draining community funds while enriching Delilah's favored law firms. She had been using association money to bankroll personal vendettas, transforming neighborly disputes into profit opportunities for attorneys who encouraged drawn-out litigation. The Stewart artists offered a psychological insight that clarified everything. She targets anyone who embodies independence or creativity, Maria Stewart noted during a clandestine coffee meeting. Your uncle lived here for decades without submitting to her authority. You've inherited that same spirit of independence, and it undermines her entire power structure. Her husband, David, added the crucial piece of information. 3 other families have left in the last 5 years. All of them were original property owners with grandfathered rights that complicated her control schemes. The pattern was glaringly obvious. Delilah systematically drove out anyone whose legal standing challenged her authority. She could not abide property owners who predated her rule, particularly those with rights that superseded HOA jurisdiction. But I possessed military training, patience, and a gift for strategic planning. While she was squandering resources on frantic legal ploys, I was constructing an unassailable case that would permanently dismantle her authority. Every incident of harassment, every false accusation, and every abuse of HOA power was being documented with evidence of prosecution quality. The autumn air was filled with the scent of victory mixed with pine needles. As I planned the final stage of this suburban conflict, Delilah believed she was drowning an adversary. In reality, she was filling her own grave with the very evidence that would bury her regime for good. The time for defensive maneuvers was over. Phase 2 would be total war. The document that would obliterate Delilah's entire regime arrived on a Wednesday morning. Masquerading as routine legal paperwork, Sarah's paralegal had been performing what lawyers term a comprehensive title search. Essentially an archaeological dig through a century of property records. What she unearthed prompted Sarah to call an urgent meeting that would alter the course of everything. Marcus? Sarah began, laying out documents across her conference table like battle maps. Sit down. Before I tell you this, you don't just possess water usage rights, you own the entire lake. The word struck me like a bolt of lightning. Every single drop of water, every inch of the lake bed, every fish swimming beneath the surface. All of it was mine through an unbroken line of inheritance stretching back to 1918. The legal finding was breathtaking in its simplicity. When Silas Blackwood constructed his dam and formed Alpine Lake, Colorado water law granted him absolute ownership under the prior appropriation doctrine. The first valid claim takes all, his 1923 deed, which transferred the surrounding land parcels, specifically held back all water rights, lakebed ownership, and exclusive riparian privileges in perpetuity. Those rights had been passed down through 4 generations of Blackwood men like a secret inheritance. Forgotten, but never legally relinquished, Uncle Ezra had owned this lake for 30 years without grasping the full measure of his power. Now that nuclear authority was in my hands, Sarah's research uncovered the staggering extent of the HOA's violations. For 38 years, Every homeowner around Alpine Lake had been trespassing on my private property. Every dock, every swim platform, every boat launch, and every ornamental gazebo had been built without permission on land and water that belonged solely to me. The financial ramifications were immense. The HOA had amassed $847,000 in lake maintenance fees over 4 decades. Money illegally collected from homeowners for services conducted on someone else's private property. Every assessment, every improvement project, every dollar allocated to lake-related activities was effectively theft from my family's estate. But the most exquisite irony centered on Delilah herself. Her $800,000 glass palace drew its entire value from its lake access and waterfront vistas. Without those privileges, her property's value would plummet by 60% to 70% overnight. She had erected her real estate empire on land she did not own, charging fees for services she had no authority to render. Her cherished meditation gazebo, the lakeside sanctuary where she devised her neighborhood destruction campaigns, was situated entirely on my riparian zone. Every HOA meeting conducted there, every violation notice signed there, every harassment campaign initiated from that pavilion had taken place on property belonging to her primary target. Sarah laid out my legal options with the zeal of a prosecutor presenting slam-dunk evidence. I could immediately forbid all lake access, compelling the removal of every structure built on my property over 4 decades. Trespass lawsuits against 47 families would yield damages far exceeding the HOA's total assets. Property liens could trigger forced sales that would decimate the community overnight. You have the grounds to bankrupt this entire HOA and most of its members, Sarah finished. Delilah picked a fight with someone who could legally evict her from her own backyard. The shift in power was exhilarating, yet something Uncle Ezra had taught me during my childhood visits resonated in my memory. He had shared this lake with his neighbors for 30 years, never brandishing his legal authority as a weapon. His philosophy was straightforward. Good neighbors foster good communities, and bullies will eventually bring about their own downfall if you give them enough rope. I had no desire to become the suburban despot that Delilah had been. However, I would not endure continued harassment from someone who had been trespassing on my property while collecting illegal fees and waging psychological warfare against my family's legacy. The woman believed she owned this lake. She was about to learn she had been squatting on my land while declaring war against its rightful owner. It was time to instruct Princess Delilah on the difference between authority and ownership. The subsequent phase demanded military precision and a legal strategy that would impress Pentagon planners. Sarah gathered her A-team as if we were orchestrating D-Day. Her partner, Michael Rodriguez, a property rights specialist with 15 years of experience dismantling HOA overreach, joined our war council with the excitement of a prosecutor who had just been handed the crime of the century. Together, they formulated a 3-tiered strategy. First, negotiate. Second, apply pressure. And third, deploy nuclear legal weapons as a last resort. Their research into comparable Colorado cases showed that my position wasn't merely strong. It was historically unparalleled. Most water rights conflicts centered on usage percentages or seasonal access. I, on the other hand, owned everything, full stop. Michael had never encountered such definitive ownership documentation extending back over a century. This is the holy grail of property law, he stated during our strategy meeting. You possess absolute authority supported by bulletproof documentation. The question isn't if you will win, but how much damage they will incur before they capitulate. Forging community alliances necessitated the subtle touch of a diplomatic mission operating behind enemy lines. My coffee meetings with sympathetic neighbors exposed the full extent of Delilah's reign of terror. Beth Morrison produced photocopied records showing $8,000 in fraudulent fines she had paid over 5 years, infractions for everything from unauthorized bird feeders to holiday decorations that violated approved color palettes. Jim Santos supplied military-grade intelligence on the HOA's financial dealings. As a former accounting supervisor, he had detected irregularities in the annual budget reports that pointed to the misappropriation of funds. Legal expenses had tripled under Delilah's presidency. While actual maintenance costs had dropped, the money was being redirected into harassment campaigns instead of community enhancements. The Stewart artists provided psychological warfare insights that illuminated Delilah's systematic targeting tactics. She would eliminate independent-minded residents who challenged her authority through their creative expression, property alterations, or by simply refusing to yield to her arbitrary rules. Their evidence included photographs of her measuring their garden fence with a tape measure, A clear sign of obsessive-compulsive control that verged on mental illness. My underground resistance network grew to include 12 homeowners who had been quietly compiling evidence of Delilah's abuses for years. They had been too afraid to confront her alone, but a united front gave them the courage to share the evidence they had been secretly amassing. Security camera footage, recorded phone conversations, written letters, a treasure trove of harassment documentation that would bring tears of joy to a prosecutor's eyes. The evidence compilation effort became my full-time job. I constructed detailed timelines for every violation notice, every menacing letter, and every act of property damage or intimidation. My security cameras had captured 3 separate vandalism attempts, along with dozens of instances where Delilah photographed my property from public spaces like a suburban stalker. A financial analysis brought the true scale of the HOA's corruption to light. Sarah's forensic accountant found that emergency assessments had been used to finance legal battles against individual residents rather than for community improvements. Delilah had essentially weaponized her neighbors' money to fund her personal vendettas, a practice that violated both HOA bylaws and state laws governing nonprofit organizations. The legal strategy session felt like planning a military offensive. Sarah explained quiet title actions, court procedures that establish definitive property ownership when conflicts arise. My case wouldn't demand complex litigation, as the documentation was ironclad. We would essentially be asking a judge to affirm what historical records already demonstrated. I owned the lake, everyone else was trespassing, and the HOA had been operating unlawfully for decades. Michael detailed the unjust enrichment claims that would compel the repayment of illegally collected fees, plus interest. Organizations can't profit from services they have no right to provide, he noted, especially when those services involve someone else's private property. The HOA's 38 years of collecting lake maintenance fees amounted to systematic theft that could bankrupt their entire operation. We calculated potential damages with the precision of military logistics officers. $847,000 in illegal fees, plus accrued interest at legal judgment rates, trespass damages for unauthorized construction on my property, and the costs of environmental impact studies that should have been performed before building on private land. The total came to over $2 million, more than the combined assets of every HOA member. The communication strategy combined diplomacy with overwhelming power. I would offer Delilah one chance for a reasonable settlement before unleashing legal nuclear weapons. 30 days to negotiate a licensing agreement that would preserve community lake access while recognizing my ownership and authority. Our backup plan involved coordinating with local newspapers, which loved a good David versus Goliath story about suburban tyranny. The final option was to file simultaneous lawsuits against the HOA and individual trespassing members, a legal carpet bombing that would shatter the community's financial stability while setting a precedent for property rights enforcement. The negotiation terms were generous, given my absolute legal authority. A $50 annual licensing fee per household, the removal of all boat restrictions, Delilah's resignation as president, and a new leadership elected through a truly democratic process rather than by authoritarian appointment. During my evening strategy walks around my private lake, the scent of autumn pine mingled with the satisfaction of imminent justice. Every peaceful sound, children playing, neighbors chatting, boats gliding across the calm water, represented the community harmony that Delilah had been methodically destroying with her toxic leadership. The woman had declared war on someone who owned the very battlefield. It was time to teach her the distinction between borrowed authority and actual ownership. Delilah's intelligence network must have caught wind of my legal inquiries, because her next move felt like the desperate final act of a cornered dictator. The emergency HOA board meeting she convened had all the subtlety of a military takeover. Her agenda included an immediate $50,000 legal defense fund, to be financed by emergency assessments that would hit every homeowner like a financial barrage. But the true purpose of the meeting was her proposal to hire a private investigator to uncover character evidence against me. Suburban warfare masquerading as due diligence. We need to understand who we're truly up against, she declared to her compliant board members. Military backgrounds can suggest aggressive tendencies that pose a threat to community safety. Her desperation was as obvious as cracks in a dam about to fail. The sabotage efforts intensified to a level that would impress CIA agents. The electrical connection to my dock mysteriously went out during a conveniently timed storm, disabling my security cameras for 12 critical hours. When I checked the next morning, the junction box showed clear signs of deliberate tampering. The wires were cut with precision tools, not damaged by the weather. My boat's engine intake was found clogged with foreign material that certainly didn't get there by chance. Someone had jammed it with rags, plastic bags, and what looked like dog toys. A mixture of items designed to cause costly engine failure if I had started it without an inspection. Only my Navy training and routine equipment checks saved me from thousands in repair bills. Anonymous complaints inundated county offices in what seemed like a coordinated psychological attack. The health department got reports of boat fuel contamination endangering drinking water. Environmental agencies received detailed allegations of unauthorized chemical disposal and destruction of aquatic habitats. Every agency had to divert resources to investigate patently false claims filed by someone with an intimate knowledge of bureaucratic complaint systems. The fraudulent environmental reports were masterpieces of suburban make-believe. Someone had submitted official-looking documents asserting that my boat maintenance was causing toxic runoff and disrupting the habitats of endangered species. The reports were filled with scientific-sounding terms that would impress bureaucrats but were utter nonsense to anyone with actual environmental expertise. Meanwhile, my quiet preparations were constructing a fortress of evidence that could withstand a nuclear attack. I installed backup security systems with cellular connectivity that couldn't be disabled by cutting the power. Concealed cameras in waterproof casings provided redundant surveillance from angles Delilah could not foresee. Every instance of harassment, every baseless report, and every act of vandalism was being documented with prosecution-grade evidence that would make federal agents envious. Water quality testing became my secret weapon against the false environmental claims. I commissioned a certified laboratory to perform a comprehensive analysis that would prove my boat posed no contamination threat. The results were flawless. Pristine water quality with pollutant levels below detectable limits. More importantly, the tests indicated that several neighbors' septic systems were closer to violating regulations than my boat maintenance ever was. The environmental consultant I hired, a genuine expert with a PhD, delivered a detailed analysis demonstrating that my boat's impact was negligible compared to natural lake processes. His report systematically dismantled every false assertion about wake damage, fuel contamination, and habitat disruption. We now had scientific proof to annihilate Delilah's environmental warfare campaign. The dynamics of community pressure were shifting like tectonic plates beneath Delilah's authoritarian regime. More residents started approaching me in private to offer support and intelligence about her previous campaigns. A picture emerged of systematic harassment targeting anyone who dared to challenge her arbitrary rule. Pattern recognition exposed her targeting strategy. Identify independent-minded residents, fabricate violations, and escalate financial pressure until they either surrendered or left. HOA financial records revealed the devastating price of her addiction to legal warfare. Community funds were being depleted by costly attorney consultations, frivolous litigation threats, and investigative services that served her personal vendettas rather than the community's interests. Homeowners were unknowingly funding their own oppression through assessments that paid for harassment instead of improvements. A growing number of residents began to question whether Delilah's presidency was worth the financial and social toll. Quiet conversations in grocery store parking lots and during neighborhood strolls exposed widespread frustration with her divisive leadership. People were weary of the constant conflict and rising expenses that served no constructive end. The private investigator she hired inadvertently became my most valuable asset. His background check confirmed my exemplary Navy service record, my volunteer work with veteran groups, and my marine conservation efforts. Instead of unearthing character defects, he documented 20 years of leadership experience and community service that refuted every negative claim Delilah had made about my integrity. His report also showed that I was considerably wealthier than Delilah had assumed. My military pension combined with consulting income made her financial intimidation tactics laughably futile. I was not some vulnerable family that could be bankrupted by legal fees. I was a combat veteran with the resources to sustain a prolonged conflict if necessary. The investigation backfired spectacularly, providing legal documentation of my qualifications while exposing Delilah's bad faith in hiring investigators to concoct personal attacks. Evening walks around what I now knew was my private lake were filled with the scent of autumn pine and the distant sound of Delilah's empire collapsing. Every desperate escalation was only digging her grave deeper while fortifying my legal position. She thought she was destroying an enemy. She was actually supplying the evidence for her own prosecution. Delilah's final move demonstrated that desperation can make people foolish, even those who fancy themselves master manipulators. The lawsuit landed like a nuclear bomb disguised as legal documents. HOA versus Marcus Blackwood was filed in district court with enough melodrama to make soap opera writers envious. It demanded $100,000 in damages for lost property values caused by the defendant's willful violation of community standards and deliberate disruption of peaceful residential enjoyment. The complaint read like a piece of fiction penned by someone who had mistaken rage for evidence. In Delilah's alternate reality, my boat had single-handedly wrecked the community's real estate market through industrial-scale recreational activities and environmental degradation visible from satellite imagery. She alleged that my diesel engine produced noise pollution comparable to commercial shipping, despite decibel readings that were quieter than most lawnmowers. But the true comedic gem was her attempt to place a lien on Uncle Ezra's cottage for unpaid emergency assessments I had never consented to pay. She had, in essence, declared war on someone she presumed was financially weak, not realizing I had the security of a military pension and legal resources that could outlast her entire operation. Her hired marine engineer submitted a report so transparently fabricated it deserved a place in a museum of legal malpractice. This expert concluded that my 25-foot boat created more wake damage than the neighbor's 35-foot speedboats through some mysterious displacement physics that defied the basic laws of hydrodynamics. His methodology consisted of standing on the shore with binoculars and measuring waves with a ruler, a level of scientific rigor that would shame a middle school student. My response was a strategic silence that drove Delilah absolutely mad. While she was incinerating community funds on frivolous litigation, I was meticulously documenting every false claim and excessive legal charge for future damage calculations. Sarah advised letting the HOA litigate themselves into bankruptcy while we assembled our nuclear counterstrike. Every dollar they squandered on baseless lawsuits would serve as evidence of bad faith litigation when we finally unveiled my ownership of the lake. The bribery attempt was disguised as a neighborly peace offering. Delilah approached me during my evening dock maintenance, wearing the insincere smile of a used car salesman about to close a desperate sale. Her generous settlement offer involved her dropping the lawsuit if I agreed to limit my boat usage to weekdays only, sign restrictive covenants regarding engine noise and wake patterns, and promise to never again challenge HOA authority. We could make this whole unpleasant situation go away, she cooed, her perfume vying with diesel fumes for dominance in the air. All you need to do is be reasonable about community standards. When I politely rejected her magnanimous offer to surrender my legal rights, her facade crumbled like cheap makeup in a downpour. You have no idea how difficult I can make your life here, she hissed with the venom of someone who had honed psychological warfare through years of suburban terrorism. The community meeting ambush was her masterpiece of manipulative theater. She called a mandatory HOA assembly, ostensibly to discuss budget planning and community safety, but the real agenda was a public execution disguised as a democratic process. The meeting room was filled with her supporters, armed with misleading handouts about boat violations and choreographed to force an emergency vote on comprehensive boat restrictions before I could organize an effective defense. Her opening presentation was propaganda worthy of a totalitarian state. Enlarged photos made my boat appear to be an aircraft carrier invading tranquil waters. Charts illustrated environmental damage, trends that correlated my boat's usage with entirely unrelated changes in lake conditions. Testimonies from concerned residents portrayed me as an aggressive interloper disrupting generations of community harmony. 3 expert witnesses delivered rehearsed speeches on boat-related safety risks, noise, pollution, and environmental ruin. Their qualifications included owning kayaks, reading boating magazines, and watching nature documentaries. Their scientific methodology involved measuring my boat's wake with pool noodles and timing its engine noise with smartphone apps. Sarah's presence at the meeting was a strategic act of psychological warfare. Her expensive suit, legal briefcase, and a court reporter's notebook signaled that this was no longer just a neighborhood squabble. When she announced my countersuit for harassment and property damage, several board members turned visibly pale as they grasped their potential personal liability for knowingly endorsing a frivolous lawsuit. The character assassination campaign reached a desperate peak as Delilah depicted me as an aggressive military operative whose boat constituted a potential security risk to the community. She hinted that my Navy background suggested violent tendencies, implied my evening cruises were surveillance missions, and asserted that my security cameras violated neighbors' privacy. But her support network was fracturing under the pressure, like ice in the spring sun. Board members started questioning the legal costs that were threatening to bankrupt the community over Delilah's personal vendetta. The treasurer voiced concerns about fiduciary duty. As association funds were being used to finance individual harassment campaigns, several long-term residents expressed their frustration with the escalating conflict that served no constructive purpose for the community. My underground allies provided a spontaneous character defense that shattered Delilah's propaganda. Beth Morrison publicly recounted my help with an elderly neighbor's dock repairs. Jim Santos mentioned my donation to the local school's environmental education fund. The Stewarts shared anecdotes about my helpful advice during their own boat maintenance tasks. The atmosphere in the room shifted as residents began to realize they had been manipulated into bankrolling a personal war rather than investing in their community. Delilah's empire was imploding from within as people discovered the true financial and social price of suburban tyranny. It was time for the nuclear revelation that would end this war for good. The Alpine Lake Community Center had never seen a more dramatic confrontation than the monthly HOA meeting that would bring Delilah's empire to ruin. 67 residents crammed into a space meant for 40. The tension so thick you could slice it with a chainsaw? Janet Mills, a reporter from the local newspaper, had strategically positioned herself with a camera and recorder, having received an anonymous tip about a David versus Goliath property rights dispute with shocking developments. County Sheriff Deputy Rodriguez sat in a back corner, summoned by Delilah's complaints about potential community disruption stemming from my aggressive military background. Sarah accompanied me like a legal bodyguard, carrying bankers' boxes filled with historical documents, survey maps, and presentation materials that were about to reshape this community forever. Her confidence exuded the energy of a prosecutor holding the smoking gun in a murder case. Delilah began with a theatrical fury befitting a Shakespearean villain. Tonight, we confront the crisis that threatens our peaceful community, she announced from the makeshift podium, pointing at me as if I were a war criminal. This emergency motion will ban Marcus Blackwood's boat immediately, safeguarding our lake from further environmental harm and restoring the tranquility we have cherished for decades. Her enlarged photos made my boat look like an industrial catastrophe. Charts showcased wake damage patterns and noise pollution data that would have impressed propaganda ministers. She demanded I pay $15,000 in emergency lake restoration assessments and remove my inappropriate vessel within 48 hours. We have overwhelming community support, she declared, brandishing her fabricated petition like a battle standard. It is time to choose between one person's selfish recreational desires and our collective quality of life. The room hummed with nervous energy as residents considered voting to strip their neighbor of his property rights based on manipulated evidence and stirred up emotions. It was then that I politely asked for 10 minutes to respond before any vote was taken. Sarah started passing out copies of the historical deed research to every person in attendance while I connected my laptop to the wall projector. The 1923 property deed materialized on the screen in magnified glory, its century-old language about perpetual water rights and exclusive lake ownership clearly visible to all. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said with the calm authority of someone holding nuclear weapons, "I don't just have the right to use this lake. I own it. Every drop of water, every inch of the lake bed, and every fish swimming beneath the surface is mine, through an unbroken inheritance from my great-great-grandfather who created this lake in 1918. The silence was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop into the crystal-clear water that, apparently, was mine. Sarah's laser pointer traced the property boundaries on the projected survey map, revealing the devastating extent of the community's trespassing. Every dock, every swimming platform, every boat launch, and every structure that touches this lake is situated on Marcus's private property. For 38 years, the HOA has been collecting fees for the maintenance of someone else's land without any legal authority. Audible gasps spread through the room as the implications sank in like stones tossed into deep water. Delilah's face went from the white of fresh snow to the red of a sunset, then to the green of lake algae as she processed the utter annihilation of her legal standing. "That's impossible!" she shrieked, shedding all pretense of dignified leadership. "Those documents are forgeries, legal technicalities. We have prescriptive rights from decades of community use." Deputy Rodriguez leaned forward with professional curiosity as the tension escalated toward potential violence. Janet Mills's camera captured every second of Delilah's public breakdown for the next day's front-page story. The documentary evidence was overwhelming and irrefutable. A chain of title demonstrating unbroken water rights ownership from 1918 to the present. Survey maps proving that most HOA lake structures were violating property lines. County records confirming the lake's classification as private property, not a community resource, and expert legal opinions affirming my exclusive ownership authority. Several board members began frantically calculating their potential financial liability as the scale of the illegal fee collection became clear. $847,000 taken from homeowners for services performed on someone else's private property, plus trespass damages for unauthorized construction spanning 4 decades, and the cost of environmental impact studies that should have been conducted before building on private land. Then came my mic drop moment, one that would resonate through suburban legend forever. I stood slowly, projecting the calm confidence of someone with absolute power, and addressed the shell-shocked community directly. I could legally demand the removal of every dock and structure tomorrow. I could forbid all lake access and sue every family for decades of trespassing. I could bankrupt this HOA and demolish your property values overnight. The room held its collective breath like divers, submerged deep underwater. Instead, I am offering a reasonable annual license for continued lake access, $50 per household, significantly less than the illegal fees you have been paying. All existing structures can stay. The community boat launches and swimming areas will be preserved. My voice carried the weight of absolute ownership softened by reasonable generosity, but the harassment and vandalism of my property ends immediately. Delilah's reign of suburban terrorism ends. Tonight, Deputy Rodriguez reviewed my evidence of property damage and false reports, confirming my legal right to exclude trespassers and warning of potential criminal charges for any continued harassment. The community responded with a spontaneous act of democracy that buried Delilah's dictatorship for good. The aftermath played out like the most gratifying movie conclusion you have ever seen. Within 2 weeks, Delilah and her 3 staunch supporters had abandoned the community like defeated generals fleeing a burning citadel. Their for sale signs appeared overnight, a desperate attempt to escape before more residents learned they had been living under the rule of someone who was illegally collecting fees while trespassing on my property. Property values did not plummet as she had threatened. Instead, they surged by 15% once buyers understood they could reside in a lakefront paradise without a suburban Stalin measuring their grass. My cottage became a destination for apologies and peace offerings. Beth Morrison showed up with a homemade apple pie that tasted of sweet victory. Jim Santos brought a bottle of bourbon with a note addressed to the man who liberated us from the HOA gulag. The Stewart artists created a stunning watercolor of my boat making gentle ripples, titled Waves of Freedom, which now hangs proudly over my fireplace. Janet Mills's article went viral on social media like a digital wildfire. Navy veteran discovers he owns entire lake, destroys HOA dictatorship, inspired copycat investigations across the country. Homeowners from Florida to Washington began examining their own property deeds, unearthing forgotten rights that predated suburban tyranny. My victory set a new standard for fighting back against petty authoritarians who confuse clipboards with crowns. The legal outcome was pure poetry. The HOA settlement of $50,000 covered every cent of my expenses, while Sarah negotiated ironclad safeguards against future harassment. Delilah evaded criminal charges by signing agreements that essentially barred her from ever holding a position of community authority again. She slithered away like a snake escaping the sunrise, leaving behind a community finally free to breathe. The transformation under new leadership was nothing short of miraculous. Beth Morrison's presidency infused a teacher's wisdom and a grandmother's affection to replace Delilah's toxic rule. Monthly dues dropped by 40% through efficient management that prioritized actual improvements over funding personal vendettas. They did away with 83 categories of harassment, transforming the community guidelines from a criminal code into neighborly suggestions. My licensing agreement provided a comfortable income while ensuring lake access for families who had considered this place home for decades, at $50 annually per household. Less than what most people spend on coffee each month. It replaced the illegal fees that had depleted budgets while benefiting no one but lawyers. The personal healing started when Sage spent her entire summer with me, evolving from a sullen teenager visiting her divorced father into a confident young woman who could dock a boat and name every fish species in our lake. Her friends filled the water with joyful shrieks instead of legal documents. forging memories that Uncle Ezra would have cherished. But the crown jewel of this victory was the Alpine Lake Conservation Scholarship, an annual $5,000 award for students pursuing environmental science or property law for 3 years running. Our recipients have gone on to protect watersheds and combat HOA corruption throughout the western states. The settlement money, which could have been spent on luxuries, instead became an investment in justice that will outlive us all. The broader effect surpassed my wildest expectations. Our case became mandatory reading in law schools and inspired Colorado's HOA Accountability Act, which compels suburban dictatorships to prove their authority before they can impose restrictions. Sarah's Law Review article has been referenced in 43 successful property rights cases, assisting families in reclaiming freedoms they never realized they had lost. Delilah's cosmic retribution was absolutely perfect. Her new gated community in Arizona proved that karma has a wicked sense of humor. Within 6 months, she was facing thousands in fines for unauthorized wind chimes and pool equipment that violated community aesthetic standards. The hunter had become the hunted. The enforcer had become the victim. The dictator learned what it feels like to live under someone else's arbitrary rule. Every morning now, I sit on my dock and watch the sunrise paint the mountains gold. As steam rises from coffee that tastes like freedom, children's laughter echoes across water that is legally mine but spiritually belongs to everyone who believes that a home should be a sanctuary, not a battlefield. The gentle ripples from my boat spread across the lake like rings of justice, reminding all that one person standing up to bullies can liberate entire communities from tyranny. Uncle Ezra's legacy, transformed into a weapon for justice rather than a target of harassment. Exactly as he would have wished, the American flag flying from my boat's stern is no longer a provocation. It is a peaceful emblem of rights defended, a community restored, and proof that ordinary people can overcome extraordinary corruption when they choose to fight smart instead of surrendering. Drop your HOA nightmare in the comments. You could be featured in next week's End for HOA episode. Smash that subscribe button to see more neighbors fighting back against suburban tyrants, and hit the notification bell because next week we're exposing an HOA that tried to ban the American flag itself. You've been watching End for HOA, where entitled Karens get a reality check. If this episode gave you secondhand rage or satisfaction, hit that like, leave your take in the comments, and subscribe so you're the first in line for more weekly HOA chaos.